Lion cub came to police station for help. What officers discovered next shocked everyone. The door didn't break, but it almost did. Police officer Noah Keene was about to reach for his coffee when the iron gate of the police station opened noisily. He sat up on reflex, not even putting his mug down. It was not a criminal who had entered. Neither a homeless person fleeing the rain, nor a citizen with a complaint. Those paws stepped silently on the floor. Tiny, wet and muddy. He looked straight at Noah, his eyes shining in the lights of the police station. He was a lion cub. Real, alive, frightened but not running away. No one moved. Computer keyboards fell silent, radio static faded in the ear. The cub took a few more steps. Without hesitation. As if it knew where it was coming from. As if he had followed a map, memorized an address. He stopped in front of Noah's desk, tilted his head slightly to the side, and then, a moan, almost a whisper. A muffled, subdued but heart-piercing sound. It was as if it was saying, "Don't be late." Something inside Noah began to unravel. This couldn't just be an animal. There was something in his eyes. Not loss. Not fear. Like a call. Like a message. But before I could make sense of it, the door opened a second time, silently this time. A large shadow appeared in the doorway. The wet floor trembled under the heavy footsteps. Noah took an involuntary step back. Most of the officers jumped. Because what came in was a huge mother lion. Its body was almost crawling. Every step was a collapse. Her feathers were wet, covered in a mud mixed with blood. Her eyes are tired but still open. Focused only on one point, her cub. The cub ran to her, nudged her with its nose. The mother sank to the ground. Right in front of Noah. She fell, not like a heavy body, but like someone who had lost hope. She was taking deep, labored breaths. It was as if she had used the last of her strength. She had crawled all the way inside, but now, she couldn't go on. No one was talking at that moment. People all around the police station, powerful, trained, tough-looking officers, were silent at the sight. The rain pounded the windows, but there was not a sound inside. Only the faint whimpering of the baby and the mother's labored breathing. Noah stepped forward. Deliberately. Not caring about the danger. He raised his hand a little, but didn't touch it. He just moved closer. Because his eyes saw something else. Not danger. It was a tear. And that tear was looking at him. No one had expected this. But that baby had made a choice. And that choice was Noah. It couldn't have been a coincidence. In the city, at the furthest point from the jungle, a lion cub doesn't walk into a police station. In that moment, it wasn't instinct, it was consciousness. It was a call for help. And now, if someone or some people didn't answer that call, it could be the end of everything. A single sentence echoed inside Noah. It was so clear. It rose suddenly in his mind, drowning out every sound. He chose us. He chose me. And no one knew it yet, but in that moment, not just a life would be saved, but a faith. The silence in the precinct was the kind that weighed on your chest. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The rain hit the windows with a kind of rhythmic urgency, like a warning from nature itself. Officer Noah Keene stood frozen. The lion cub, drenched, trembling, and impossibly small, was still staring up at him with wide, pleading eyes. Its whimper echoed in his ears like it was meant for him alone. Then, something shifted. A shadow crept across the floor, slow and heavy. It was not cast by a person. Noah's eyes snapped to the entrance. There, framed in the flickering fluorescent light, stood a full-grown lioness. Her head hung low, eyes half-lidded, her breath heaving like her lungs were made of sand and glass. Every step she took forward left behind a wet mark, a mixture of rainwater, mud, and something darker. Blood. Her massive body trembled under its own weight. muscles spasmed with exhaustion. Her sides rose and fell in erratic gasps, and her paws slipped slightly as she tried to cross the threshold. Noah didn't even hear Officer Ramirez whisper, "Jesus Christ," behind him. He didn't notice the other officers standing up, half reaching for their sidearms. His entire focus tunneled in on the lioness and the cub. Because the cub, without fear, without hesitation, had turned and was already trotting toward her, the lioness barely noticed anything else in the room. Her gaze locked on her cub like that was the only thing still tethering her to this world, and then, in the middle of a police station in the middle of a city, that lioness collapsed. Her legs gave out in one fluid, final motion, and her body hit the floor with a heavy thud. It wasn't just a fall. It was a surrender. Like her body had finally admitted what her spirit had been fighting against for hours, the cub let out a tiny, desperate cry and immediately pressed its nose to her face, licking at her cheek, nudging her with its head, as if to say, "Get up. Please get up." Noah didn't remember moving, but suddenly he was right there. Inches away. He dropped to one knee slowly, both hands raised slightly, palms out, fingers twitching with nerves. He didn't know what he was doing. He just knew he couldn't do nothing. The lioness blinked slowly. She saw him. She didn't growl. Didn't bare her teeth. She was breathing like someone who had almost drowned. Every breath a miracle. Then she did something that shattered every rule of instinct Noah knew. She shifted her head, not much, just enough, and with the last bit of strength she had, she nudged the cub toward him. Noah's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. She was giving him her cub. "Officer Keene," someone whispered behind him. He didn't answer, because in that moment, it wasn't about protocols or wild animal response codes. It wasn't about danger. It was about something far older. Something primal. Something deeply human. He whispered, "She's asking for help." Suddenly the lioness's eyes rolled back, her chest heaved, and she stopped moving. Noah lunged forward without thinking, yelling, "She's not breathing." The words shattered the silence. Everything exploded into motion. Officer Carter rushed in from the hallway, yelling into his radio, "Get animal control. Emergency veterinary response, now." Someone pulled out a first aid kit, useless. Someone else began calling dispatch for wildlife experts, but none of it was fast enough. The cub was whimpering, circling its mother's body, its tiny paws slipping on the wet floor. It kept trying to lift her head with its own, like it could will her awake. "Move," a sharp voice snapped. Everyone turned as an older woman with short gray hair and a bright yellow raincoat strode into the precinct, pushing through the chaos like it was mist. She dropped to her knees next to the lioness and began assessing her with quick, clinical precision. "Dr. Rachel Williams," she said without looking up. "Wildlife Emergency Unit. Don't touch her." Noah backed away slightly, but not too far. The cub followed him. It stuck close, right against his leg like he was a tree in a storm. "Doctor." Williams ran her hands over the lioness, checked her breathing, then her gums, her pulse. "She's severely dehydrated," she muttered. "Heart's faint. I need fluids. For now. She doesn't have long." One of the animal control officers handed her the kit. Rachel worked quickly. Years of fieldwork had taught her not to waste a single breath. As she inserted the needle and connected the line, Noah couldn't take his eyes off the lioness's still body. She looked ancient and broken and yet, sacred. Like she carried a history no one in the room could comprehend. "She walked here," he murmured. "Dragged herself, all the way here." Dr. Williams didn't look up. Because she had nowhere else to go. The cub let out another soft cry and curled up beside its mother's head, pressing its tiny body against her cheek. It looked at Noah again. That look was unbearable. Like it was asking, "Did I do enough?" And suddenly, Noah's chest ached. He had seen people cry for their mothers. He'd seen loss. But he had never seen something like this. A creature from the wild, choosing them. Trusting them. He dropped to one knee again, closer this time. He reached out, slowly, hesitantly, and the cub didn't move away. Its fur was damp and cold under his fingertips. "I've got you," he whispered. It blinked up at him, then, behind him, the front doors creaked open once more. An old man stood there, hunched slightly, with a tattered coat soaked from the rain. His eyes were pale but clear. "And they were locked onto the lioness. I saw her," he said softly. "And the cub? Been watchin' them for days." Dr. Williams turned sharply. "You know them?" The old man nodded slowly. "The mother was dyin'. I think she knew. But she kept movin'. I don't know how, but she headed straight for this place. She pushed herself past the river. Past the hills. The cub led her here." Silence followed. Noah stared at the cub again. How would it know where to go? The old man met his gaze. "Because it's not like other cubs. I've seen it watch people, study them. It was never afraid. It trusts. It understands." Dr. Williams whispered, "Instinct doesn't explain this." A beat passed. Then the four began to drip. Everyone held their breath. The lioness twitched, once, then again. She inhaled sharply, eyes fluttering open just a sliver. The cub stood. It pressed its forehead against hers and made a tiny sound, like a mule mixed with a sigh. Noah turned away, swallowing hard. Something was lodged in his throat and he didn't know what to call it. Grief? Relief? A memory of something he hadn't lived but suddenly felt. Dr. Williams sat back. "She's not out of the woods. But she's responding." Noah nodded slowly. His eyes were on the cub. The little thing had done the impossible. It had led them here. Had believed in something beyond the wild. It had crossed an invisible boundary that so few ever dared to touch, and for what? For a chance, for its mother. The storm outside had softened to a steady drizzle. But inside that room, something had shifted forever. A wild animal hadn't just come for help. It had come for them, and now, they had to be worthy of that choice. Noah had never felt smaller in his life. The precinct, usually filled with the low buzz of conversation, the clacking of keyboards, and the occasional burst of laughter, was now suffocating in its silence. The storm outside had faded into a quiet drizzle, but inside the walls of the station, something massive hung in the air. Not fear. Not chaos, something sacred. The lioness still lay motionless on the floor, the four-line snaking from her flank. Her breaths were shallow, irregular, like her lungs didn't trust the world enough to inhale fully. The cub had not moved an inch from her side. It sat pressed against her chest, eyes wide and unblinking, its tiny chest rising and falling with rapid, uneven breaths, and Noah couldn't look away. He'd knelt there for minutes now, just watching. The weight of what had happened was beginning to settle in his bones like cold rainwater. He was no stranger to tragedy. He'd seen death, had to carry the weight of other people's loss before. But this? This was different. This wasn't just a rescue. It wasn't just a wild animal wandering into the wrong place. This was a story that had chosen them. "You okay?" Officer Ramirez asked quietly behind him, voice low enough not to startle the cub. Noah didn't respond right away. He stared at the lioness's eyes, flickering open and closed, as if each blink was a battle. Then his voice came, soft and distant. "She gave her cub to me." Ramirez didn't speak again because how could you respond to that? Noah slowly sat back against the wall. The linoleum felt cold through his uniform. The cub turned to glance at him, its head tilting just slightly. Like it was checking on him. Unbelievable, someone muttered, but it wasn't, not to Noah. He didn't know why, but he believed it. All of it. Every impossible second of this story felt real in a way nothing else had for a long time. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small granola bar he hadn't eaten from earlier that morning. It was crushed now, but still sealed. Slowly, he unwrapped it and broke off a small corner, holding it out in the palm of his hand. The cub hesitated, then it moved one paw, then another, cautiously but without fear. It sniffed the food, looked at him again, and took the offering from his palm with surprising gentleness. It chewed quietly. Noah blinked hard, something stung behind his eyes. When was the last time he'd felt needed, really needed? He didn't have a family. No kids. No partner waiting at home. Just this job and the hours he poured into it. And now, this creature, this tiny ball of fur and spirit, had walked into his life with the weight of its world on its back, and handed it to him, not by accident but by choice. Dr. Williams knelt nearby, adjusting the 4-line. Her vitals are improving slightly. But she's not out of danger. Noah nodded. Can she be moved? Not yet, she replied. Too risky. She needs rest. Time. Fluids. How much time? Rachel looked at the cub, who had finished eating and now curled up against its mother again. I don't know, she admitted. Noah sighed and leaned his head back against the wall. The ceiling tiles above him were old, water-stained in the corners. He stared at them as if they could offer answers. He remembered something his father used to say, animals don't talk, but they never lie. He hadn't understood it as a kid. Thought it was just one of those weird dad phrases. But now he got it. That cub hadn't said a word, but it had spoken volumes. As if on cue, the front doors creaked open again. This time, it wasn't a lion. It was a woman. Middle-aged, wrapped in a heavy raincoat, with a soaked backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked out of breath, like she'd run more than walked. I saw it, she gasped. I saw the lioness collapse in the woods. I thought she was dead. But the cub, it kept moving. It kept pushing her. Everyone turned to her. I was out there hiking, she explained. Got caught in the rain. Then I saw them. The cub wouldn't stop. It looked back at me, right at me, and then ran toward the road. Noah stood. You're saying it led her here? The woman nodded, still panting. That cub, it wasn't lost. It had a plan. Another layer of silence fell over the room. Rachel whispered, it's like she wasn't just trying to survive, she was trying to reach us. Noah looked down at the cub again. It was asleep now, head resting against its mother's neck. But its breathing had slowed, steadied. Like it knew, the worst part was over. He sat back down and let the moment wash over him. Every instinct told him to question it, to rationalize. But his heart told him the cub had believed in something and it had been right. A memory surfaced, one he hadn't thought of in years. He'd been 12. There was a dog, injured on the side of the road. Everyone else passed by. But he'd stopped. Sat with it for hours until someone came. His mom had yelled at him, furious he'd disappeared, but later that night, she'd held him close and whispered, you did the right thing, baby. You were brave. That had been the first time he felt like he mattered, and now, that feeling was back. He reached out again, gently brushing the cub's fur with his fingertips. I'm not letting you down, he whispered. The storm had ended. But the story had only just begun. The front door of the precinct opened slowly, creaking like a sound from another time. At first, no one noticed. Their focus was still on the lioness, who was barely clinging to consciousness, and the cub who refused to leave her side. But then the air in the room shifted, just slightly, but enough. Someone was standing in the doorway. Noah turned. He expected another officer, or maybe someone from animal control. But instead, there was a man, old, stooped, wrapped in layers of damp wool. His beard was thick and white, tangled like forest undergrowth. His coat looked older than Noah's entire career, with buttons missing and sleeves frayed from years of use, but his eyes, those didn't belong to a lost old man, they were clear. Sharp. Watching everything. I've been waiting, the old man said softly. Noah stepped forward, cautious but curious. Waiting for what? For this. That answer hung in the air like a riddle. The room quieted again, save for the steady dripping of the four and the soft, ragged breaths of the lioness. The man looked past Noah, right at the cub. You brought her, didn't you? He whispered. The cub didn't move. But it looked at him. A single glance and the old man smiled just like before. Noah felt his skin prickle. Before? The man walked inside slowly. Not with the gait of someone frail, but someone deliberate. Measured. As if each step meant something that he crouched, surprisingly agile for someone his age, and settled near the lioness, but didn't try to touch her. He sat like someone in the presence of something holy. I've seen them before, he said. This cub, this one's different. Rachel looked up from her supplies. You know this animal? He nodded. Not like you'd know a pet. But yes. I've seen her. Many times. Watching the edge of the forest. Closer to people than she should have been. Noah frowned. So she's been tracking us? No, the man said. She's been learning. A silence fell, the man's eyes flicked back to Noah. There's something you don't understand. That most people never even think about. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Sometimes, the wild chooses to speak. And very rarely, we're smart enough to listen. It sounded like nonsense, but it felt like truth. Rachel stood slowly, folding her arms. With all due respect, sir, we need facts. This cub showed up here, yes. But there has to be a reason. Some logical explanation. The man didn't argue. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, creased, weather-worn. He handed it to Noah. Noah unfolded it slowly. It showed the same cub, smaller, maybe just a few weeks old, standing in the middle of a hiking trail. Alone. But what caught Noah's breath was what was behind the cub. A body. A human body, lying still in the background. I found him, the man said. He was injured. Snakebite, maybe. Would have died alone. But the cub led me to him. I followed it. I thought it was just curious at first, but no, it stopped beside the man. It kept trying to get my attention. And when I got there, I called for help. The guy made it. Noah's fingers tightened around the photo. You're telling me, this cub saved someone? The old man nodded once. And now, she's brought you. The room was frozen. Rachel blinked. That's impossible. But no one spoke against it, because in that moment, impossibility didn't seem so impossible. The cub stirred slightly, resting its head against the lioness's shoulder. It looked tired. But not weak. More like it had done everything it could, and was trusting the rest to them. I don't know how, the man said. I don't pretend to understand it. But this cub, she knows things. She seeks help, not safety. That's not instinct. That's something else. Noah lowered the photo. He wasn't a spiritual man, but right now, he was ready to believe. The storm had passed. Outside, the world was still and wet, bathed in gray light. Inside, something ancient was unfolding. The kind of moment you don't realize you've lived until it's already part of you. Noah knelt again beside the cub. He whispered, "Why us?" The cub didn't answer. It didn't have to, because sometimes, the silence tells you more than words ever could. The moment the second four bag ran dry, the lioness began to tremble, not a shiver. Not a twitch. A full body tremble that rattled through her like a quake rolling across fragile earth. Rachel dropped her pen mid-note and rushed to her side. Noah, who had just started to feel something close to relief, felt his stomach knot instantly. The cub's head shot up. It whimpered, louder this time, and pressed against its mother's side. Frantic, "She's crashing," Rachel muttered, already opening a third fluid pack. Heart rates dropping. Something's wrong. Noah stepped back instinctively, heart pounding in his ears. What's happening? She's dehydrated beyond what I thought. Her kidneys may be failing. And the blood loss, he interrupted. Rachel didn't look up. There's internal trauma I missed. I need to move her now. We wait any longer, we lose her. A loud screech cut through the tension, the sound of tires skidding outside. A second team had arrived. Emergency wildlife transport. A stretcher was being rolled through the doors before the engine even stopped humming. 2 techs, soaked and wide-eyed, sprinted inside, following Rachel's gestures with military precision. The lioness barely moved as they lifted her. Her body was dead weight, heavy, limp. The cub tried to climb onto the stretcher with her, pawing, crying out in sharp, heartbreaking yelps. It didn't want to be separated. Noah knelt and gently held it back. "I know," he whispered, voice cracking. "I know you don't want to leave her. But you have to let them help." The cub turned, eyes wild and wet. And for one painful second, it fought him, clawed weakly at his arm like a desperate child. Then, as if something deep inside surrendered, it stopped. And Saturday, watching, waiting, Rachel and the team worked in a blur. Vitals were checked, restraints added, fluids reinforced. The lioness's breath came in gasps, then shallower. The monitor beeped erratically, her pulse is fading. Someone shouted. Noah gripped the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. The cub didn't move. Didn't blink, just watched. And in that moment, the entire precinct held its breath. Every soul in that room was no longer a cop, or a medic, or a technician. They were witnesses. To something terrifying. To something sacred. To the moment life decides if it will stay or go. Rachel slammed her fist onto the side of the stretcher. Not yet. Not after all this. She injected something. Noah couldn't see what. A pause, then, beep. A slow, weak blip on the monitor, then another and another. She exhaled, hands trembling. She's stabilizing. Barely. But she's holding on. Noah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The cub slumped beside him, curling into a tight, exhausted ball. Still watching. Still waiting. She fought, Rachel said, softer now. She was already dying when she came here. She should have collapsed hours ago. But she didn't. Noah's voice came out rough. Because her cub needed her. Rachel met his eyes. And now, she needs you. He looked at the cub, so small. So broken. Yet somehow, still full of fire. He whispered, "You brought her here. You saved her. Now we'll get her home." But the question burned in his chest, would home still be there by the time they arrived? The road out of town was soaked in the afterglow of the storm. The emergency transport van moved slowly, its lights cutting through the mist curling up from the asphalt. Inside, everything was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. Beep, beep, beep. Noah sat beside the lioness, knees drawn up, eyes locked on the cub sleeping curled against its mother's chest. She was stable, but only just. Every breath she took still felt like a gamble. Every second, Noah wondered if it would be her last. Then, somewhere along the winding forest road, her eyes opened, not halfway, not fluttering, fully, wide, golden, burning. He straightened, hardly daring to breathe. The lioness turned her head slowly. Her eyes scanned the unfamiliar space, then stopped. Right on him. Noah froze. She was looking at him, not with fear. Not with confusion, with recognition. As if she remembered. As if she knew. And then, her paw moved. Barely. But enough to touch her. It stirred, lifting its head, blinking sleepily. When it saw her awake, it let out a low, warbling cry, half question, half joy. The moment didn't last long. She closed her eyes again, but this time, not from weakness, from peace, the kind of peace that comes when the worst is finally behind you. By the time the van rolled to a stop deep in the forest reserve, the first rays of sun were breaking through the canopy. Soft gold spilled across the earth like a blessing. Noah helped the team carry her out. The cub walked beside them, never more than a paw's length away. They laid the lioness gently beneath a large oak tree. Rachel crouched beside her, checking vitals one last time. "She's strong," she whispered. "Stronger than we thought." The cub didn't wait for permission. It curled up beside its mother, pressing its body into hers like it had from the start. She responded this time, one massive paw resting over the cub's back. A hush settled over the clearing. Everyone stood still, watching. Noah stepped forward. He crouched just once more, meeting the cub's eyes. They stared at each other, man and creature, protector and survivor, and then, for the first time, the cub blinked slowly, turned away and didn't look back. It had done its part. So had he. Rachel moved beside him. Come on. Let them be. Noah stood. And for the first time in a long time, he felt full. Not of answers. But of something far better. Meaning, somewhere out there, in the wild heart of the world, a mother and child were safe. Because one small creature had dared to believe in something more than instinct. And one man had listened. As they walked away, Noah said softly, "She chose right." And maybe that's what it all came down to. Sometimes the ones with no voice are the ones who speak the loudest, and if you're lucky, you hear them in time. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, share this with someone who needs to believe in hope again, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true life stories from the heart of the unexpected. We're just getting started.